morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're signing in from today. I noticed it was a fairly international audience, so appreciate you joining us. I'm joined today by Highland Copper CEO Barry O'Shea and Project Director Dr. Wynand van Dyk. Gentlemen, great to see you both today.
Nice to see you, Romeo.
Thank you, Romeo.
So I want to let everybody know, here's the format for today's event. Barry and Wynand are going to run us through a brief presentation outlining progress across both projects. Then I'm going to pop in for a few questions myself. And then finally, we're going to take questions from the live audience, starting with some sent in over email in advance. Speaking of, just for those in the room, today's event is interactive. The chat button in the bottom right of your screen is available throughout the presentation to ask questions at your leisure. We'll try to get to as many as we can during today's presentation. But if for whatever reason we don't, I'll still make sure Barry and the Highland team receive them so that they can answer them separately. Last piece of housekeeping from me, today's event is being recorded. Will be available this afternoon for your review and share. It'll be on both Six.com, but also on YouTube. That's enough out of me. I'll get to the protein of today's event and pass it along to Barry and Wynand.
Thanks very much, Romeo. So listen, the way I start all of these presentations is with the three key takeaways that I think are most important for you to understand as you think about Highland Copper. And so starting with permits, Copperwood is arguably the only fully permitted project in its peer group, certainly in the US or any tier 1 jurisdiction, a major distinguishing factor. At number two, again, Copperwood has peer leading leverage to changes in copper price, giving significant optionality as we look forward to development and production. And also just the importance of our location. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the US is a historic mining district where we have permits, but more importantly, true license to operate. All of these things needed as you think about progressing a project. And really, when you think about optionality, not just in terms of asset value as copper price changes, but certainly in terms of our ability with permits in hand to move to being a producing asset and beginning to enjoy the valuation multiples that producers enjoy. So really now it's a matter of execution, and later in the presentation, that's what we're going to speak to today. I certainly hope that our news release that came out earlier this week, or I should say last week, demonstrated that execution and gives comfort that we're going to move forward at pace as we move towards a construction decision at Copperwood. So looking at the next slide, certainly what I always encourage investors to look at, what are the true fundamental building blocks of any junior company? It begins with location, it begins with permits, and it begins with resource scale. You need all of those things to be a viable development asset. And we think we have all of those, giving rise to truly a long-lived asset with production over multiple decades, setting path for a nice production growth profile, really at a period of time when we think copper is also going to take hold, looking at the long-term fundamentals. And looking at the next slide, this really gives you a sense of the resource scale, and I do think it surprises certainly new investors that look at Copperwood who sometimes deem Highland to be a smaller asset. But looking at Copperwood, there's 3.7 billion pounds of copper defined, giving rise to an initial mine life of 11 years, nearly 70 million pounds of copper annually. But that's derived from the 54 million tons of measured and indicated. And if you look at the resources, an additional 79 million tons of inferred. So really what you can understand is that this is not an 11-year mine life. This is going to be 15 to 20. And looking across at White Pine, which is really nicely sequenced, because while we're stepping towards construction decision at Copperwood, White Pine is arguably 2 to 3 years behind thinking about engineering and permitting. And it has 5.4 billion pounds defined, acknowledging, of course, we're a 34% joint venture partner. But again, giving rise to a 20-plus year mine life at 90 million pounds of copper annually. So you really see scale here and capacity to grow into the region. And as well, I just wanted to point out the size of the prize. At the end of the day, understanding net asset value and your capacity to accrete to it is critical. And again, looking at the leverage. So understanding at $4 copper, which we don't think we'll be sitting at for very long, the economics are strong. Looking at Copperwood, it's 170 million NPV and an 18% IRR. But most importantly, if you move to $5 copper, so a 25% increase in copper price, it gives rise to a 300% increase in net asset value to 507 million. And White Pine is similar on the right-hand side. We're just showing the asset value related to our 34% stake. And again, looking at $5, it's a 525 million interest. So, consolidated $1 billion in net asset value that with permits in hand, looking at leverage to copper price, we believe we're going to continue accreting towards with execution. And execution is important. And the transaction that we did with Kinterra to sell a portion of White Pine really unlocked us. It means that people like myself and Wynand are broadly spending 100% of our time and our capital thinking about advancing Copperwood, whereas Kinterra is putting their time, capital, and energy into White Pine. And we've certainly seen that. So with that, let's talk about execution. And of course, the first step with that is putting the right people in place. And I've been more than happy to bring Wynand van Dyk into the company in the past months. Considerable experience, not just in development and operations, but very much so on the design side, which we're going to leverage over the coming months as we step into detailed engineering. But Wynand, if I could ask you to just give an update of goings on at site, that would be great.
Yeah, Barry, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody out there. Yeah, I'm super happy to report that our site teams have done an absolute stellar job in the last construction season together with our contracting partners. In essence, we've completed all of our initial site impacts on wetlands and streams. So if you look at this right-hand picture, that's one of the stream diversions that we've put in with quite a complex in-stream structures, all designed to obviously minimize long-term impact. And on the right-hand side picture, you can see how these stream diversions are now already starting to mature with some natural growth, minimizing the impact. If you go to the next slide, we've also done some work on and completed our work on the wetland mitigations. In this case, at our site, we created an 18-acre on-site wetland, which we call Gypsy Creek. That's the picture on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, all the necessary anti-erosion structures has been installed, and I'm happy to report those are starting to overgrow as well now as we stand. We're also establishing a 700+ acre wetland preservation area. So our offset is about a 12-to-1 in terms of what we're going to impact or what we have impacted versus what we are establishing. And I think for us that is the key. Why did we do all of this work? Partly it was permit requirements, but it's also establishing an operating presence. We're getting to know the area. We are forming really great partnerships with contractors in the area, getting to know and working with our unions, and just demonstrating our environmental stewardship overall. And then I would almost say more importantly, or most importantly, building solid partnerships with our stakeholders, in particular Eagle in this case. So if we go to the next slide, what's next? Well, at this point in time, we steadily executing the project, advancing towards a construction decision. The state grant, we've spoken about it before. Just a quick recap, it was approved by the Michigan Strategic Fund. The House then approved it as well. And we currently in the last stage of approval with the Michigan State, or Senate, sorry. In terms of union engagement, we've signed a letter of intent with our unions in the area. And that is basically about an intention of a project labor agreement so that we can execute these projects safely and comfortably. And we're really fortunate in that Michigan has got highly trained, really competent labor force that we could use in our project. And then lastly, in terms of detail engineering, we've adopted a phase approach on our engineering, which is stage gated. And the whole design is that we will de-risk and optimize Copperwood as we go through these stages. So we're happy to report that we're about to move into phase 1. Then there'll be a stage gate going into basic engineering, and then another stage gate moving into detail engineering. And at this point in time, everything is set up to support due diligence when it comes to our project financing.
And a quick update also on White Pine. As I mentioned, we're executing on Copperwood, and our partners, who are the operators of White Pine, Kinterra, are really executing at speed on White Pine. And that partnership has been fantastic. Without them, arguably, White Pine would be sitting as a second asset on our priority list, and we would be doing limited work on it. but instead that asset is moving forward quickly. And on the next slide, you can see some of the reasons why it was valuable to Kinterra. This is a past-producing mine site. It operated 50 years up until the mid-90s. There is still road, rail, and power coming into sight. As I mentioned, the 5.4 billion pound resource, and really fundamental building blocks to step forward into permitting and engineering. And so on the next slide, just some of the items that we dealt with in our recent news release. Kinterra has completed alongside us 21,000 meters of drilling, and that predominantly was for the purpose of collecting all of the met and geotech samples that are needed as we move forward to engineering studies. Unfortunately, that piece is complete and all of the samples are collected. The second drill program in particular that occurred through the summer was also assayed. So Kinterra will look forward to doing an update in the first half of next year in terms of updating that resource. Environmental baselining is timely and one of the most important things that you need to do before you step into your permit applications. And we outlined in more detail in our news release, but there was a whole host of baselining studies that were completed through 2024. That work will be ongoing into 2025 as we prepare to submit permit applications. And similar to us on Copperwood, they're also advancing engineering trade-offs as they think about stepping towards, be it pre-feasibility or into feasibility study, all of the ways that they can consider to improve the project on the mining side, on the met and geotech side. So all the things that they can do there. And we feel very comfortable, certainly with their technical capacity as they push that project forward. And looking at the last slide before we get into questions, which obviously is the more intended purpose of this webinar, just want to remind everybody of the big picture here. The Western UP in particular has a rich history of mining, massive copper belts, obviously, not just Copperwood and White Pine, but others. The Eagle Mine is active in the region, owned by Lundin. Of course, you'll have seen Talon recently put out results from both a copper and nickel perspective. So this region is really re-emerging. We obviously see Copperwood as this fantastic first step, a manageable first step back into the region as a producer. We believe that White Pine is next in line after that with us, alongside our partners in Kinterra. Access to cash flow, of course, leverage to copper price, which I think is an important defining feature of our company, and a host of asset strategy options, whether we build this ourselves, whether a larger player looks to consolidate the region broadly. So we're very excited about the prospects. We're excited about the big picture, but it's a matter of execution in the meantime, and certainly we think we're demonstrating that. And with that, Romeo, happy to kind of get into the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Awesome, appreciate it. And thanks for those who have plugged in messages in the chat. I'm going to go through a couple of my own first. If that's all right, I'll grill you both very quickly. Barry, I got one to start with you. I know, and as you mentioned, you've completed pretty significant environmental work at Copperwood. As I understand it, creating and preserving wetlands 12 times larger than the impacted area. So I'm curious in kind of two parts. How does this approach help de-risk the project on both the regulatory, but also the community side?
Thanks, Robin. And I think Wynand mentioned this to some degree already, but first and foremost, obviously, we need to maintain our permits in good standing. They're an extremely valuable asset of the company. So when you look at the wetlands and stream permits, particularly the impacts and those offsetting and mitigation factors that we put in place, our permits are all in very good standing. But demonstrating that environmental stewardship, it creates a real trust, not only with the environmental authorities, but truly with the community who we know are supportive, but of course, want to see us operating in a very positive way. We certainly believe that industry like mining can coexist very naturally with tourism and certainly environmental protections, and it's very much our intention to continue to operate in that manner. Some other nice byproducts, of course, is that you've begun to prepare the site for construction, so de-risking from that perspective. And nicely, we put a portion of the initial capital behind us, all positive as we think towards construction decision.
Great. Wynand, I have one for you. As you move towards detail engineering at Copperwood, what are some key risks and opportunities that you're currently assessing?
Romy, let's deal with the risks first. I think one of the key things for us is the timely delivery of power to site. What's the options? How do we get power to that area? Secondly, the overall water balance of the plant. We committed not to take any water from Lake Superior. So we need to have a reliable engineering solution that can survive if we have periods of extreme rainfall as well as periods of drought. We would need to be able that whenever we want to start up, we've actually collected sufficient water that we can start up until the water becomes project becomes water positive. And then last risk is just like any mining project, you're mining in geotechnical conditions. You're really matching your mine plan to what's in the earth. Opportunities, I think there's a whole host of opportunities. Ultrafine flotation technology is maybe the first one for us. Looking at extracting a barren fraction early in the milling circuit using coarse particle flotation, which makes everything further down the line smaller. The footprint becomes smaller, the mill power consumptions become smaller. It's just if that is possible, a real value add for us. Optimizing the layout of the plant. If footprints become smaller, it gives you that luxury of really, really getting tight in terms of how you design these facilities. And then lastly, just how we sequence our mine in terms of planning versus to maximize the NPV, that we don't just take the mine sequentially as it's there, but literally working through and optimizing NPV from a mine plan perspective.
I appreciate that. Curious, if you could you elaborate on the ultrafine flotation technology you're considering, and what is the potential economic impact of it?
Yeah, let's quickly talk about it. I think most flotation equipment suppliers have nowadays got ultrafine flotation technology out there. And the reason it's out there is because it actually works. Now, the idea behind this, when particles become really, really fine, which is our case, the challenge is basically threefold. You want your flotation process to be selective, so it's got to pick between a valuable particle and a non-valuable particle. I have to be able to get enough energy into these particles that they can actually go and attach to the bubble surface, and there's some surface forces that takes place there, and I don't want to entrain so with the water that the particles become so small that I just pull barren material over the salip. So these equipment, typically they've got really ultra-fine bubbles, so that increases the likelihood of particle bubble contact. It's got a dedicated bubble particle contact zone, which is designed so that you don't just shear these ultrafine particles off the bubble surfaces. And then lastly, typically wash water. So there's quite a lot of water going through the circuit, washing the gang material out of your frost structure. So yeah, sorry to get technical, but that's what ultrafine flotation gives you.
No, appreciate it. I certainly invited you to be technical, so that's great. I have one more question for you, Wynand. Can you give us a better understanding of the phased approach to detail engineering that you referred to in this last release?
Yeah, look, I think most capital projects nowadays are executed on a stage gate type of approach. The reasons for this is multiple. It de-risks projects fundamentally. So in our case, we would start off with what we call phase one, which is the objective is we want to absolutely put a stake in the ground on design criteria. The last thing you want to do is when you start doing basic engineering and heaven forbid detail engineering, that you start changing design criteria, because that's where it costs you a lot of money and you start shredding paper, and that becomes expensive paper. So really phase one is about nailing down design criteria. That includes these optimization opportunities that we spoke about have to be bedded down, and the risks have to be addressed. We need to be sure that we can put that one to bed. Once we earn that right, there's a stage gate that'll then get us into phase two, which is basic engineering. The objective of that basic engineering is we'll come up with a control budget estimate that we can control the project against, a definitive schedule. You'll have updated bill of quantities. You will have, we can actually place orders on all of our long lead items. That's the idea. And then, when that shows you that you still have a project that is financeable and that makes economic sense, you then pull the trigger on the execution decision, and you then do your detail engineering all the way through into construction management.
Awesome. No, appreciate that. Barry, I'm going to jump to you for one. And this is actually reflected also by a question in the chat from Paul Zed. For the impatient among us, I was wondering if you could give a bit of color on why the state grant is taking just a bit longer than expected to get over the line.
Sure, and yeah, listen, it's required a lot of patience, and truthfully, it's worth the wait. It's a grant for $50 million, a direct grant, so it's not an equity injection or a loan. It's a pure grant, so it's worth the time and the energy. To begin with, maybe I just reflect the progress that we have made. Of course, the MEDC proposed it in January of this year. The Michigan Strategic Fund at a civil service level approved it in March. The House at the legislative level approved it in June, and now we're at the Senate level. And honestly, at every level, the questions have been just a little different, although I would say they've all focused in and around social license to operate, environmental impacts, and community impacts. So at this stage, we're just continuing to work with the Senate patiently, as I think we should, helping them understand all of these things so they, as the approvers before them, are fully comfortable with the decision. We still remain comfortable with the process. We're trusting in that process and certainly believe our patience will pay off.
No, great. And one other question on the grant, actually. How does it affect project economics generally?
Yeah, well, I mean, as it is a grant, and arguably it would come in year one of construction, essentially as a reimbursement for infrastructure expenditure. So, as we spend money bringing power to site, local road upgrades, and so on and so forth, we see reimbursement, and we get paid back dollar for dollar up to $50 million. And of course, that's right at the outset of the overall NPV period. So it's broadly speaking a dollar for dollar impact on the NPV. And that translates to about a 4% change in IRR. So whereas the IRR today of the project is 18%, just inserting that grant brings the IRR to 22%. So as I said, a really great prize. But importantly, it's an endorsement from the state of Michigan. And we know that the state of Michigan is doing a lot of work here. They particularly wanted to understand that we were welcome in the local communities, and we provided to support our grant application 22 letters of support, essentially representing all local townships, counties, municipalities, boards, etc. Formal resolutions reflecting support, not to mention letters of support from the collective 13 unions in Michigan. So again, just an ongoing endorsement from the state that we look forward to.
Oh, great. Wynand, one more question for you on Copperwood, actually. With your pedigree, not to make you blush, what drew you to the Copperwood asset?
Yeah, Romeo, the world needs mining. There's just no argument about it. If we want to do what we want to do from electrification and all of that, we have to mine. And frankly, the old saying goes, if it's not grown, most likely it's been mined. But the reality is the industry, let's be honest, really didn't have a stellar track record out there. We've made some really decisions that we shouldn't be proud of as an industry. And I got stuck with this about 10 years ago in my life. And I had to decide, do I sit on the sidelines and keep on criticizing the industry, or do I actually become part of the solution and show that mining can be done right? And I was really fortunate. I got recruited to be a project manager for a mine in South Africa. It was in a really environmentally sensitive area, but in an area that was also particularly impoverished, and not a lot of opportunities for locals in that area. And the commitment was all about, how do we design this out? How do we design the project so that these environmental concerns are addressed, not as an afterthought, but embedded in the overall project. The project had to withstand the economic test with those design parameters included. I'm so happy to say that that community now is a thriving community. There's opportunities for people, for kids in schools, and those perceived risks didn't materialize, not because they were underestimated, because they were literally designed out. And I then got recruited to come across to the United States. I joined a fertilizer company, and we did the same thing in projects in Brazil and projects in Guinea-Bissau. And then I just super happy and excited to join the Highland team. I guess the nice part here is this is just personal for all of us. I think every single person in this team is just committed to the same thing, doing mining responsibly. And that's why I joined the team. Really great opportunity.
No, that's great. Appreciate that. Barry, one more on Copperwood, and then I got a couple of questions on White Pine. Appreciate all the questions in the chat. We're just about to get to those. Barry, what's the estimated capital requirement to bring Copperwood to production? And if you don't mind answering now, how do you plan to structure the project financing?
Yeah, I think if you look at our feasibility study, and it was done by G Mining, it's current, it's from 2023. It's approximately a 400 million capital expenditure for the overall project, so manageable for a company of our scale. Naturally, we see the first leg of a financing being the state grant of $50 million, and certainly we look forward to that materializing. Once that's in place, I think that kicks us off in terms of the traditional project financing, and we'll run a pretty robust process across private equities, banks that play in the natural resource space from a project financing perspective. We've certainly done our calculations, and looking at the economics of the project, we think it has debt capacity for approximately $200 million. So that will be a focus, in the immediate aftermath of the state grant. There are other elements of debt, certainly asset financing, offtake finance that we'll consider, but naturally there will also be an equity plug. And by the time we get to that point, thinking about an equity raise, which, as you know, will be the last capital in, a whole host of things will happen. We'll have, certainty around the state grant. Obviously, we'll have visibility to the project finance. We'll have a better view of our detailed engineering, certainly as we think about due diligence and supporting that overall debt financing process. And naturally, we also think we'll have a stronger copper price. So all of those things will lead to a share price that will honestly be more palatable when we think about raising equity for the purposes of a project finance.
Oh, that's great. There will be couple more Copperwood questions just from the audience, but I wanted to ask a couple on White Pine just before we jump to those. Wynand, the first one I'll shoot to you. If you could, just help myself and the audience understand the nature of the engineering trade-offs that White Pine has to go through right now.
Yeah, look, that White Pine team, I think they're doing a great job at this point in time. They're answering the fundamental questions that you want to get answered when you develop a mine. These are questions on the geological and the hydrogeological understanding of the ore body. What does it look like down there? How do we then match our mining methods and the mine plan and get that working? The geotechnical conditions we need to understand, what can we build where? And then, the metallurgy, what about, how do I optimize the grind versus recovery curve? How do I optimize recovery versus mass pull? Residence time and flotation circuits, the reagent suite, the chemical conditions. And then the last piece of work that they're busy with is just on tailings. What's the deposition strategy? Overall, how do we dewater this and alike? So, yeah, they're doing a good job in going through all of those trade-offs at this point in time.
Great. And what was the purpose of the 2 drill programs over the last year, and what's next on those programs? Yeah,
so their first program was all about extracting metallurgical samples, which Barry alluded to. There were some geotech samples that came out of that, but that's getting samples so you can do all of these metallurgical tests for grind recovery curves and the second drill program was more infill drilling, so it was all about expanding resource. But they also used the opportunity of extracting metallurgical sample, which is good. You're putting a drill hole in the ground, and that's expensive. You might as well maximize the value that you get out of it. And did some downhole surveying and getting some additional geotechnical data. So, those assays is currently being done. And then the next step is once that comes back, then it will be obviously updating the resource model accordingly.
Great. Barry, I got one for you on White Pine. Just asking you to zoom out a bit. I know you executed the transaction to JV White Pine, I think, over a year ago now. I'm curious, has it worked out as you hoped?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the scale of work completed and the time, energy, and focus put into White Pine over the last 15 months, I think you'll understand that it really has. As I mentioned, there would have been modest work that we would have been capable of doing over this period of time, whereas White Pine has both had the technical resources and, of course, the balance sheet to really press forward hard on drilling, environmental baselining, and getting the project to where it is today. So, really, it was that division of labor and capital with us managing Copperwood and Kinterra as the operator managing White Pine that has really played out as we have hoped. And certainly happy with Kinterra's technical strength. They brought in very strong people in the same way that I brought Wynand in. They brought very strong people in on the technical side, on the ground, also, generating that license to operate. And, the work that we do at Copperwood, I also think has a massive read through to White Pine in terms of the credibility that we bring. We believe Kinterra will do the same. So yeah, we just look very forward to both projects. They remain nicely sequenced and yeah, just advancing with methodical execution.
Great. There's one question that came in from an investor over email. He's an investor who's wondering about synergies with Kinterra at White Pine. I imagine he means for Copperwood, such as potential use of their existing processing plant and refinery to try and save some capital costs at Copperwood. Just curious your perspective on that and what the plan is.
Yeah, sure. So, and just so you know, actually, just in advance of us selling a portion of White Pine to Kinterra, we did some, I would call it PEA level like work on that. And, there's certainly an opportunity to look at that, and arguably Kinterra, who are the operators, will look at it at some point. But also wasn't jumping off the page, to send ore from Copperwood to White Pine obviously would require trucking or rail, which is a relatively expensive proposition. And the geology of the ore as it comes out is just slightly different. So, not a perfect match in terms of processing technology. So I think it is something that we as partners can look at in the future. I can certainly say that whether or not the two sites share very specific infrastructure, there is incredible synergies from a management perspective. Two projects are less than an hour away from each other. So when you think about management, procuring, design, engineering, you name it, these two projects have considerable synergies. As I always say, I think there's a strong case to make that these projects, in whatever form it is, will come back together at some point.
That's great. Thank you. A couple of questions from the chat, some rapid fire ones on just timing. Derek from the chat asks, is there a projected time frame to when the Copperwood mine plan design will be sent out for contractor proposals?
So maybe Wynand, you can speak a little more so to the bidding process on the engineering piece. If there's a read through to contractors, so be it. Obviously, that's not imminently in our work. But Wynand, I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, look, if I understand the question correctly, Romeo, we're talking contract mining piece. That is our philosophy. We want to start off with contract mining. Obviously, we got to get through basic engineering, get through our detailed engineering as well. I would think somewhere early 26 is more or less the time that those inquiries will start appearing in the marketplace. We have done the physical inquiries on the engineering and the design work, but the physical engineering work, contract mining work, that'll be still some time before that comes out.
Great, thank you. Chuck has a question from the chat. He asks, when can we expect a ruling on the air permit, both in terms of how soon it can come, but also how long it might take?
Wynand.
Yeah, so there has been a request to postpone the public comment period, which we agreed to. So it's been postponed to December the 3rd, if I remember correctly. Typically, it just doesn't work, Eagle prefers not to issue any sort of permit over the Christmas and New Year period. So we're expecting the permit to arrive after January the 2nd. Given that we're still now in an open public comment period, I haven't seen the list of questions that's been asked, and to take a judgment call on how long it will take for Eagle to actually collate all of those questions and then turn it around into answers before awarding the permit. That's incredibly difficult to put a timeline to. We're hopeful that somewhere January, February next year, we will definitely be awarded the amendment on the air permit.
Great, thanks. Spencer from the chat asks, are any royalty or streaming agreements in place for either of the two projects?
Yeah, certainly there are. There's a collection of local landholders specific to Copperwood. that have a sliding scale royalty on the project, and at $4 plus, it maxes at 4%. So if you look at our feasibility study, it has a 4% royalty related to that set of local landholders. Osisko also has a 1.5% royalty on the project. A similar thing at White Pine, I think to slightly lesser scale in terms of the total obligation. I think of more importance at White Pine is that there's actually a reasonable silver credit there, and Osisko have rights to purchase that silver as the project progresses towards production. So that actually is another area where we've entrusted Kinterra to think about that obligation. It's a pretty sizable stream in favor of Osisko. Something that we think can arguably be restructured to facilitate, a positive construction decision at White Pine.
Great, thanks. Paul Z, I think we've already tackled your question about the grant, but let me know in the chat if we didn't. Paul J wants us to look into a crystal ball here for a second and ask, what potential barriers do you see could prevent moving forward at Copperwood?
When you take a look at a project, in particular an early stage project that is at initial discovery, there's arguably 15 to 20 years that you work through in terms of defining your resource, your engineering, your permitting, so on and so forth. I mean, quite honestly, we're the best part of 12 to 15 years down that path. So a lot of the things that really get in the way from a binary perspective of stopping a project, we're through. The resource is very well known. The engineering study is done by a reputable firm, and of course, permits are in hand. That being said, we have to carry on. We have to get through our detailed engineering. We need to better understand the overall project, both from a risk perspective and an opportunities perspective. I think Wynand gave a good view of the handful of key ones that we're working through on each of those sides. We certainly don't see any showstoppers there, but naturally, we want to make a responsible construction decision, meaning that the economics of the project at the price rating at that point in time are robust enough that we as a junior mining company can get through construction, and we're looking forward to that.
Great, thanks. One question that came in over email just a few seconds ago is from Jeff. He just wants you to go over, it's a good refresher for everybody, what the details are of the JV at White Pine with Kinterra. Just the percentages, I think, would be great.
Yeah, of course. So Kinterra own 66% of the project. We executed that last year. We sold it for $30 million. That's the capital that we're now using to advance Copperwood. Just as an aside, then the joint venture combined agreed to a separate $30 million to advance White Pine, which we're working through at the moment. And positively for us, of that $30 million budget for the project, our 1/3 or $10 million, we have access to a $10 million loan from Kinterra. It's unsecured at 10%, certainly better capital than we could get elsewhere, and we're taking advantage of that. So yeah, just a deal. Yeah, honestly, where I trust and hope both sides won. Certainly good for the project.
Oh, great. Chuck asked as a follow-up to a previous discussion. He's curious if there's any connection between the wait time for the grant and the waiting for the clean air permit. Is curious if those are related items.
No, they're not related items. That permit. I won't go so far as to say it's procedural, but it's an engineering permit. And you'll have seen already. Obviously, we have 2 of the 3 approvals that we need. All of those approving entities, be it the Michigan Strategic Fund or the House, or certainly now the Senate, they have a very close tie to EGLE, the Permitting and Environmental Authority. And to be quite honest, EGLE, I think, speak favorably on our behalf. They visit site regularly. They've inspected our work. They've confirmed that the wetland project that we're doing right now is arguably the largest wetland creation project in the state. They're very happy with our design and execution. And certainly as we work through the air permit update, it has been methodical in the way that we've always observed EGLE operating. They've been very communicative. The public comment period that is going on, obviously there was a public comment meeting, and there were no certainly challenging engineering questions posed. So really, we feel very comfortable both with that permit renewal, but also that it is not tied in any way to the state grant.
Great, thanks. Hope that clears that up. One question from the chat: is there any chance of a grant from the Federal Department of Energy for this project?
Well, it's interesting you ask. Obviously, there's considerable capital available from both the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense, and arguably as we go forward in Trump administration, that continues. So yeah, there are opportunities that we're looking at. We're looking at the value of potential grants that we can get, but also the knock-on impacts of federal review that we need to bear in mind. So yeah, we're looking at that. There certainly is capacity there, and we'll report back if we make progress.
That's great. I know we're a bit over time, but Barry, I'd love to throw it to you if you have anything you'd like to close on today.
Yeah, no, when I talk to mining investors, and listen, there are so many opportunities to invest in mining, very specifically on the gold side, less so certainly in copper. But when you look at juniors like us, you really need to look underneath the hood, and we invite that scrutiny. And you'll see, a project that truly does have the fundamental building blocks, obviously in terms of scale of resource, permits. We're now building the team. I think we're continuing to demonstrate execution as well, which is most important. But there's just a nice opportunity at this point in time. Copper has oscillated a little bit in terms of price movements in the last 6 to 12 months. But there is no argument that the long-term fundamentals and midterm fundamentals are set up very well. There's a shortage of supply globally, and it's even more pronounced if you look at the US, and demand is growing. So the long-term fundamentals are in place. And this is at a point in time when companies like ours haven't seen any significant movement from a valuation perspective. So you get a little bit of a free option to do your research on companies like ours. As I say, we invite that. We're certainly open to personal investor meetings to help people understand what's under the hood here, and of course how through execution we surface that value, and we look forward to moving forward.
Awesome. Well, Barry, Wynand, thank you so much for running through a presentation and subjecting yourselves to grilling. Always appreciate that. And everybody in the chat, thanks for joining today, and obviously thanks for asking your questions. If you have any more, you think of the perfect question right after the event ends, please do still submit it. I'll make sure the Highland team gets it. But otherwise, I hope everybody has a wonderful day.